In Greek mythology, the sea god Proteus was a shapeshifter who could tell the future. But, as we learned in Homer's Odyssey, Proteus would only foretell the fates of a person who could manage to catch him. Proteus eluded this capture by changing into various objects or animals, like a lion or a dolphin or even a tree. So, he was the first Wonder Twin. But to those who could capture Proteus, they would find out what their fate would be. And in a postmodern, hypermediated society, our identities are constructed through cultural building blocks. These building blocks assault us now at a rate unlike ever before in human history. We've gone through the electronic culture age and into the hypermediated age. These cultural building blocks change us. As Marshall McLuhan put it, media leaves no part of us unaltered. This leads to a condition in a history of restlessness and flux. And trust me, in a modern day when Dennis Rodman is our lead diplomat to North Korea, we are in a time of flux. Robert J. Lifton calls this the Protean Self. The self that is in constant change, reflecting the postmodern society around it, constructing itself as multiple fragmented identities. This makes it more difficult for us to establish what is a real me, and some of us react to this in a way seeking authenticity to try and construct a single concrete self. I'm keeping it real. This is who I really am. This is the wrong thing to do. In fact, by embracing the concept of a protean identity, we can find success by being adaptable to all of our challenges. Everything that faces us, we can rebuild ourselves in a new image and a new identity that is appropriate for that situation. We can also come to understand our subjects better, those of us who are working in whatever field. Understanding our subjects as multidimensional rather than, say, a one-dimensional and easily described entity, knowing that they are in constant change. Our observations are only of that moment, in that place, and in that time that we make them. So today, we're going to first discuss the concept of the protean self before understanding some ways of knowing our complex selves and the complex, multifaceted identities of other people. And finally, examining some case studies of individuals and organizations that have leveraged the idea of the protean self. These points are entirely going to be illustrated as a function of screen images that I've captured off of television. My job at Deadspin involves me watching many different feeds of television, both sports and news from around the world, at all hours of the day. And the fun part about my job is that I look for interesting or funny or strange moments in those live television feeds. So all of these images that we're going to use to illustrate the points are going to come from those. And I hope that at least some of them will be somewhat amusing. So, why the protean self and why now? Technology is the key here. I already cited Marshall McLuhan. So, the grounds for rapid historical change have come about because of the advance in technology. This started around, say, 1960. This applies to both people who are already in power and those who would seek to disrupt power. Those who are in power leverage a 24-hour news system. Political beliefs now. Let's go back 113 years to 1900. What did it mean to be a conservative or a progressive in 1900? It meant holding about 10% of the political views that it would be necessary to qualify oneself in those political categories today. The reason being that electronic and now hypermediated culture have created a whole wealth of opinions by which you are supposed to identify with if you are self-categorizing yourself as one of those people. So we have more opinions than ever before. That's for the people who are in power. For the people who are out of the power structure, we learned from Bowers and Oakes in the book, The Rhetoric of Agitation and Control, that electronic culture can be leveraged, that the mass media can become a tool of those who do not have power. We learned this in a positive example from the Civil Rights Movement. The agitation tactic of escalation was used by nonviolent civil rights protesters to induce authority figures to commit violence against them, and thus gain sympathy from people who were non-committed to the civil rights movement before that. On the other hand, we see today in the Westboro Baptist Church a hate group whose every single person in this room only knows about the Westboro Baptist Church because they've gained media attention, because we, as journalists, have covered them. And by our coverage, they gain new people who are sympathetic to their cause, and they gain money. They also use the escalation tactic that I mentioned before, but this is mostly about promulgating their message of hate. What is the tool of that promulgation? Us. In general, though, the world as we can see it, and our place in that world, are more uncertain than they ever have been before. And you might think a shape-shifting identity, changing yourself to fit whatever your circumstance is, that might seem like a lack of authenticity. The reality is that the most authentic identity is the one that you create yourself. Acknowledging that these building blocks are coming from all around you, these cultural artifacts that bombard us, we have the opportunity to embrace some of them and reject some of them. Or think of it another way. You are rolling constantly through the world. You are never stopping. You are picking up the things that are helpful. You are dropping off the things that are not. The more that you have agency in this process, the more your identity is really you. This is who we are. This is our self, or selves. But since we're constantly in movement, and everything that enters our five senses changes us, we are never static. Either are our subjects. But this is the evolution of humanity. Instead of knowing who we are, we can embrace who we might become. This makes us better. It makes us more complex. It makes us more well-rounded. As writers, as editors, as producers, as future subjects, and knowing our subjects that way. It also makes us more skeptical, and this is a good thing, mostly, because by rejecting a concrete definition of yourself, it opens you to new and alternative options. Since 1975, Americans' faith in their government figures has sank every year. This is good. It opens the door for such things as the Tampa Bay Times PolitiFact Project, Pulitzer Prize winning PolitiFact. It also opens the door to conspiracy theorists like Alex Jones and truthers. So, we understand some basic concepts about the Protean Self. Now we can look at how it's emerging within ourselves and in our subjects. The Protean Self allows for a more developed sense of who we are and who others are. Now this is something that photographers especially have understood for a long time. Photography is the art of taking something that exists in 3 dimensions and converting it into 2 dimensions. In portrait photography, we have lighting, framing, and depth of field that we can manipulate to create a great portrait. In spot news, photographers need not only be aware of all of those previous aspects, but also another dimension, time. Spot news photographers need to know not just what is happening now, but what is going to happen in order to place themselves in a position to take a proper exposure. So, the goal of any project, if we are going to mirror the idea of the photographer, both putting themselves in the now and in the future, is that we all need to become multidimensional. Get an idea of our subject before we attempt to illustrate it. This keeps us from thinking that we can paint an easy picture of the subject. Which sort of brings us to the Manti Te'o part of this story. Ronaya Tuiasosopo is an individual who created an online character named Lene Kekua. This Lene Kekua character developed a romance with the Notre Dame football player Manti Te'o. But the Lene Kekua character existed for 4 years. In fact, it existed long before Manti Te'o ever met her. And people asked me after we published this story back in January, how do you think that this guy, this kid living with his parents, managed to keep up this hoax for 4 years? How did he know how was he able to keep up the voice on the phone and stay in character? It might help you to think about this guy and Lene Kekua as being both parts of his identity. That Lene Kekua was a reaction to a threat for Ronaya Tuiasosopo, so much so that she became part of who he was. if it's actually a part of who he is it really going into character? It might shed a little light on that story to understand that. Now, this all obviously is a bit of a caveat to our ability to report on subjects. If I'm sitting here saying, these people that you are writing about, these people that you are broadcasting about, these people that you are examining are not actually going to be the same by the time you publish your story as they were at the time that you reported on them, that's depressing. However, it's also an opportunity. Recognizing these limitations helps us produce as fair an evaluation of our subject as possible. And so we're going to talk about reflexivity. Reflexivity is the concept of bending back upon oneself, as we see Tom Brady doing here. Reflexivity allows us to both recognize the positives that we have performed and the places that we have failed. By being reflexive, we provide insight to those who are seeking background on how we produced anything, whatever it is that we're tasked with producing. We provide that background. It also provides lessons to ourselves. What worked? What mistakes were made? How can we learn from them? We must all be reflexive. And fortunately, technology presents us with an unprecedented opportunity for reflexivity. Traditional print publications can use online video to augment reporting. Investigative reporters can produce a video that appears next to the article online explaining how they came to find out about the story, how they progressed in reporting it. Some newspapers are already doing this. But I call on, say, the Tampa Bay Times and other newspapers to go beyond this. Let's make editors part of that process. Let's hear from editors, which is normally a very opaque aspect of the publishing process. Let's hear from editors, letting us know why they made the decisions that they did, maybe some mistakes that they made. How did the origin, the genesis of a story, go from that moment to the moment that a reader read it? Let's share those things with the people who are our readers or our viewers. It makes us better, and it makes them better. Most importantly, we must be willing to abandon the concept of searching for ourselves. This is something that is part of the human condition, always trying to find one's self. Instead, we must embrace the idea that we are multiple selves. Knowing where we are in time and place is the key to succeeding in a postmodern world. So, we know what Proteanism is. We've talked about how we apply it. Let's look at some case studies. First, Gordon Parks, photographer, novelist, musician, film director. Coming up in poverty, was inspired by the work of Walker Evans, Dorothy Lang, found in magazines on trains. He went from shooting pictures of brothels in the ghetto to fashion in Paris, having drinks with Winston Churchill. What he said in his autobiography was that he was willing to listen to anyone who was going to offer him anything that they had to say. And thus he was able to reconstruct himself and who Gordon Parks was into whatever situation he found himself. This is why he was able to be successful in so many fields. But let's look at the words of Gordon Parks himself. In his autobiography, he wrote, and this is no better examination of what it means to be protean, "I am a wayfarer on an alien planet. I have lived in so many different skins, it is impossible for one skin to claim me." That's a positive example. Let's look at a negative example. Alqaeda. Now, the idea of proteanism is very anti-fundamentalist. That's the whole fact that you are able to adapt to things. And as a fundamentalist organization, you might think Al-Qaeda, that doesn't sound right. But who has grasped the power of the internet? For an organization that was best known for hiding out in caves, Al-Qaeda now uses the internet to recruit. They also have responded to the military's assumption that they are a hierarchical organization and just using decapitation techniques. How many times were we told that Al-Qaeda's number 2 had been taken out? Al-Qaeda has now decentralized. They are a flatter structure. It's much more difficult for them to mess up that organization. And finally, what else has Al-Qaeda done? By understanding that the CIA is listening to their every word, they've gone above ground. Al-Qaeda now holds Q&As with reporters on Twitter. By increasing the amount of noise, it makes it more difficult for the CIA and other organizations to find the signal. So, we have looked at the protean identity, how it's used, and some case studies. Success. Who has adapted the most? Well, we see here Snowfall, another Pulitzer-winning article from the New York Times. Is the New York Times doing the Protean? Are they a Protean organization? Certainly they've adapted in some ways, but have you ever looked at a New York Times Twitter account? They're not really getting it. And furthermore, the New York Times use of Facebook is last generation. They can go a long way in improving that. Furthermore, we can learn some lessons from this and understand that technology creates new avenues for producing value out of content that we already have. I mean, think about the photographers that you know that are producing hundreds and hundreds of exposures for one given story. How many of those pictures appear in the newspaper? 1, 2, maybe 4? There are dozens and dozens and dozens of other good exposures that anybody smart would be putting with that story in a gallery in the web version of the article. This isn't happening. This is free content, guys. Let's give it to readers. We can make money off of it. We don't have to pay anybody for it. It was already taken. It was already paid for. See? Finally, let's all be more reflexive by understanding that how we produced content, the mistakes that we made, what we did well, what we didn't do well. We can also understand this with our audiences and our subjects. We may always be changing, but it adds a great deal to everything that we produce if we share with those audiences how and where we did it. So today, we've looked at what the Protean concept of self is. We've looked at the elements of it within ourselves and in our subjects and some case studies. Hopefully, we can take one last example from a guy named Charles Steinmetz. Charles Steinmetz was born with severe physical disabilities, and he went on to become one of the first electric engineers. He was fundamental in developing alternating current, without which we would have none of the technology that enables us to be adaptable today. Steinmetz, in recognition of the way that he had changed himself to adapt to his challenges, changed his middle name to Proteus. So I ask you today how you may have challenges in your careers and how you can change yourself to meet them.